Hi guys, hope you're doing well today. This video will be a brief introduction to rivers. We'll go through the upper course, middle course, lower course, and basically just go over some key terms. So you can use this to revise or as a bit of a sneak preview if you haven't learned this yet. But obviously in year 11 this will be mainly revision and we'll tie into our stuff on coasts too. So first of all, there's two different profiles when it comes to rivers. You have the long profile and cross profile. The way I look at it is the long profile is the longer distance of the river. So can you imagine the start up here and the finish, the mouth down here? We'll get to that in a minute. The whole length of the river and how it changes. The cross profile, is as if you're standing in the river and looking up it. Okay, so you're standing in the middle of the river and looking out like this, almost looking at both banks, how deep it is, how wide it is. Obviously when you look at certain sites it'll be a cross profile. When you study the whole river as one, that'll be the long profile. So you have at the very start the source, where the river starts. Okay, as it flows down, what happens is the river gets wider, the river gets deeper, and the river gets faster. There's more energy, there's more discharge. We'll come on to those words in a minute. But ultimately, the river changes, it gets bigger. It gets wider, deeper, faster. The reason for this is because of the big vertical erosion going on. It's very steep. There's high relief, high topography in the upper course where the source is found. That's why you get so much vertical erosion, almost like eroding the ground below you. As the river goes through, it starts to get obviously wider, deeper, but also the gradient gets flatter. So by the middle and the lower courses, the river is the opposite. It's flat, but it's wide, it is deep now, and it is very fast. Can you imagine from the start to the finish, wider, deeper, faster, but also the gradient gets flatter. So you have the start, which is the source. At the other end, you have the finish, which is the mouth. Now, a river only finishes when it enters into the ocean. That's when a river finishes. Or you can get a river joining another river. We'll come on to that in a moment. So, I've just briefly told you how the river changes its characteristics. Let's look at some key terms. In the upper course, you're going to get vertical drops. A vertical drop in a river is a waterfall. As the waterfall retreats, carves its way through the landscape like a knife through butter, it leaves behind a steep-sided valley called a gorge. Okay, for a waterfall to form, you can imagine this being the waterfall here. The river flows over and drops, a vertical drop. Now what will happen is this will start to erode, and the overhang can collapse, and then ultimately you're back here, and it keeps happening until the waterfall is retreating up the course, up the stream. Then you're in the middle course, so you get lots of bends in the rivers, they're meanders. You get smaller rivers joining the main river. So smaller rivers are called tributaries, and they join the main river. And the point where they join, so two rivers flowing together to meet in one, is called a confluence. Okay, that's in the middle course. Again, we're getting wider, deeper, and flatter. And then in the lower course, normally where people can live, obviously by the sea, it's very flat. The river's at its widest, at its deepest, and at its fastest. The reason why it's at its fastest, even though it's not as steep, is because if you think about it, if the river's very small, a lot of that flow is going to be very erode. Well, it's going to be a lot of friction because the banks and the floor are not that deep and not that wide. So there's less friction. So there's more friction. Whereas in the lower course, think about this: the river's really wide. There'll be erosion here. There'll be erosion here. There'll be erosion here, of course. But a lot of the water in the middle there is flowing freely. So it gets more energy. That's what discharge is. Discharge is the energy of a river, ultimately. The amount of water that passes through a certain point over a certain time, often per second, for example. In terms of other key... Sorry, I had some problems with my battery, so let's finish this one now quickly. So you also have the watershed, which is the boundary around a river drainage basin, and then you have the drainage basin itself, which is basically an area full of all the river and its tributaries and all bodies of water. Now in terms of obviously things you can do to help prevent flooding and stuff and planning, that will all come later. but there's mainly the key terms surrounding rivers. Some of them overlap obviously with that of coasts, of course. I do just want to mention levees. So levees are where the river floods, deposits sediment on the side of the river, on the river banks, and then banks are built up either side, and that's levees. They're raised banks. You may be asked a 4-marker on how they form. The other thing, in the middle and lower course, normally middle course, is an oxbow lake. That is caused by the process of erosion and deposition, also with flooding helping as well, where basically a river's meander gets cut off as the river turns towards more of a straight path, and then you leave behind this kind of oxbow-shaped lake. These are all formed by erosion. Now, erosion and deposition are happening all the time in a river as it bends, okay? So this, again, hopefully is good revision for you. So that as a river bends around this way, for example, on the inside bend, the river is actually slower. If it's slower, it has less energy. If it has less energy, it can carry less sediment, therefore deposition happens, okay? Therefore, you get something called a slip-off slope, which is basically a load of sediment that's been dropped. Or, on the outside bend, it's the opposite. It's faster, it's deeper, and therefore you get more erosion than deposition. So what you're left with is a river cliff, which is basically a steep riverbank on the outside bend of a river, okay? And I think that's everything. If any other key terms come up, I'll definitely bring them up in a later video, but there's a lot of key terms that I've introduced, and I hope that you can get your head around that. Watch this more than once. Go back, write down some key terms, make some flashcards. If you get familiar with these key terms, they are really useful. The last thing I do want to say is the 4 different types of erosion, okay? So erosion's happening all this time for creating the waterfall, creating the meander. 4 different types. And if you can remember these 4 now, then you can use them again when we look at coasts. So if small bits of sediment, well, erosion is obviously where the material is worn away and the rocks or sediment gets smaller and more rounded, okay? So when sediment hits into each other, so you can imagine pebbles hitting each other, that's called attrition, okay? Instead, when the rocks scrape along the river banks or the floor, they scrape along like sandpaper, they rub, that's called abrasion. If you have the sheer force of the water, like you imagine a firefighter's hose, the sheer force of the water punching the rocks, hitting the rocks, breaking them apart, that's called hydraulic action. And then if you have really small sediment, then what happens is that can dissolve like sugar in tea or salt in water. It dissolves, that's called solution. Now that's the 4 different types of erosion. What you also can have is transportation. That's basically where sediment that's been eroded or is being eroded travels, transports, moves down the river. If it's really big sediment, like really big boulders, they tend to roll along the riverbed floor because they're too heavy to float. So they roll along the floor, that's called traction. If they're a bit smaller, they might tend to bounce. They're a bit heavy to float consistently, but they do have some more energy to float upwards and bounce. So that's called saltation. If it's just they hover in the river like this, that's called suspension. And the last one of transportation is solution again. So that is where it's the same thing, where sediment is dissolved in water and travels through the water like, again, sugar in tea. Hopefully that's good revision for you. Any questions, put them in the comments. I'll see you soon.